Hello, welcome, and thank you for joining me tonight. I am Joan, and tonight we are gonna step into the wilderness of Midian, into a land of dry hills and long shadows, where a man named Moses walked behind the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, not yet knowing that the ordinary path beneath his sandals was leading him toward holy ground. Before the fire appeared, before the voice called his name from the midst of the bush, before the man who had fled Egypt would be sent back to face it, there was only the slow movement of sheep over stone, the wind crossing the open places, and the burden of a past he did not often speak aloud. The land of Midian did not rush. Its valleys were carved by heat, distance, and seasons that taught men to wait. The earth was pale and rough underfoot, broken by thorn bushes, low shrubs, and stones warmed all day by the sun. Here, water mattered. Shade mattered. A shepherd learned the folds of the hills the way another man might learn the rooms of a house. He knew where the flock could pass without scattering, where a narrow trail bent around a ridge, where a hidden hollow might hold enough grass to keep the animals moving one more day. Moses had learned these things slowly. He had not been born to this work, at least not in the way others had. The men of Midian had grown up reading the wilderness from childhood. They could look at the color of a cloud and speak of the coming wind. They could listen to the nervous sound of goats and know whether a jackal had crossed nearby. They carried the desert in their bones. Moses carried something else. He carried Egypt. Not as gold, not as power, not anymore. Egypt was no longer the palace courts, the carved pillars, the measured steps of servants, or the gleam of the Nile under morning light. For Moses, Egypt had become a place behind him, a place filled with memory too large to untangle. It lived in flashes, the cry of a Hebrew beaten under the sun, the look of fear in a man's eyes, the sudden weight of what Moses had done, the terrible knowledge that Pharaoh had heard of it, and the road that had led him away into exile. Years had passed, and yet some roads remain inside a man long after his feet have left them. Now his days were filled with different sounds: the bleating of sheep, the scrape of hooves on rock, the creak of a water skin, the low murmur of wind moving through dry grass. He had a wife, Zipporah, daughter of Jethro. He had a place among a household that had received him when he was a stranger at a well. He had work that asked nothing of his royal education and little of the questions that lay buried in him. Morning came and the flock needed leading. Evening came and the flock needed gathering. In this repetition, his life had grown outwardly simple. But simplicity is not always the same as peace. There were moments when the wilderness seemed to make room for old thoughts. When the flock spread across a slope and the sun lowered in a copper haze, Moses could stand alone with his staff in his hand and feel the silence press around him. It was not empty silence. It held the sound of distant places. It held the names of his people. It held the cries he had once tried to answer in his own strength. It held the question that had followed him from Egypt into Midian. Who was he truly? A Hebrew child drawn from the river, a son raised in Pharaoh's house, a man who had defended one of his own and then fled for his life, a shepherd in another land. He did not know that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had watched every step. On this day, the flock had wandered farther than usual. Moses was not careless. Shepherds did not drift without purpose. He had guided the animals beyond familiar grazing places, past the easier slopes, toward the backside of the wilderness. The path rose and narrowed, winding through ridges of stone where the light fell in bands across the ground. The air was dry enough that each breath tasted faintly of dust and sun-baked earth. Above him, the sky stretched wide, washed pale near the horizon and deepening slowly overhead. Horeb stood ahead, the mountain of God, though Moses may not have called it that yet with full understanding. It rose from the wilderness not with lush beauty, but with an ancient kind of severity. Its sides were rugged, its lines dark against the evening glow. There are mountains that invite men to climb, and there are mountains that seem to wait. Horeb seemed to wait. The sheep moved in scattered clusters, their wool brushed with the last warm light. Some lowered their heads to search among sparse tufts of grass. Others pressed along the path, knowing only the voice and movement of the shepherd before them. Moses watched them with practiced attention. He carried his staff not as an ornament, but as a tool worn smooth by use. With it he steadied himself over rough ground, nudged straying animals back toward the flock, and tested stones before placing weight upon them. The evening was descending with the patience of a veil. In the low places, shadows gathered first. They filled the cuts between rocks and pooled beneath thorn bushes. The wind cooled slightly as it passed over the higher ground, bringing with it the faint scent of dry scrub and distant dust. The animals settled into a slower rhythm. Their bells, if any hung from their necks, would have sounded soft and uneven, small notes slipping into the widening hush. Moses paused beside a rough outcrop and looked across the land behind him. Midian stretched away in broken folds of earth, lonely and vast. Somewhere beyond those distances was the home of Jethro, the tents, the evening fires, the voices of family. Farther still, beyond wilderness and memory, was Egypt, with its river and brick fields, its gods of stone, its throne and its bondage. He had been gone so long, long enough for his face to be weathered by desert light, long enough for his hands to know the work of sheep and rope and dust, long enough that the people in Egypt who remembered him may have wondered whether he was dead, long enough that Moses himself may have wondered whether the days of his importance had ended before they had ever truly begun. But what he did not yet understand was waiting just beyond the firelight of ordinary sight. The Bible tells the story with great simplicity. Moses kept the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the backside of the desert and came to the mountain of God, even to Horeb. It is a small verse, quiet and plain, yet within it is the turning of a life. No trumpet sounds, no royal summons arrives, no messenger runs across the hills calling his name. A man at work brings animals through a lonely region, and heaven prepares to interrupt him. So much of Moses' life had been shaped by hidden providence. As an infant, he had been placed among reeds in a basket sealed against the water, while danger moved through Egypt. Pharaoh's daughter had found him. His own mother had nursed him. He had grown in the house of the very power that oppressed his people. Then, in the fullness of time, his heart had gone out toward the Hebrews, though his first attempt to act had driven him away. From the river to the palace, from the palace to the wilderness, every season had seemed at times broken from the one before it. Yet God often writes a single story through chapters that do not seem to belong together. The shepherd did not see that yet. He saw the path. He saw the animals. He saw the rock and the scrub and the declining light. Perhaps he thought of water. Perhaps he counted the flock. Perhaps he considered whether to turn them before darkness deepened too far. His mind may have moved through the small calculations of survival, the kind that keep a shepherd alert even when the world seems unchanged. A young lamb edged toward a narrow cleft between stones, and Moses stepped after it, his sandals scraping loose gravel. He lifted his staff and guided it back, not harshly, but firmly. The flock shifted, responding to him in a wave of wool and movement. Dust rose lightly around their legs and drifted away in the evening air. Then he continued upward. The farther he went, the more the land seemed emptied of human traces. No market road crossed there. No crowded settlement broke the horizon. There were no brick kilns, no overseers, no palace walls reflecting the sun. Only wilderness, only a mountain, only a man who had learned how to disappear. But the God who sees does not lose a man in the wilderness. The light changed again. The gold of late day thinned into amber, and the stones took on a muted red-brown color. Long shadows stretched from the thorn bushes like dark fingers across the ground. The sky held that brief softness that comes before evening fully gathers, when the world seems to pause between labor and night. It was a time for shepherds to seek a resting place, to gather the animals close, to prepare for cold air after the heat. Moses scanned the slope ahead. There were thorn bushes scattered among the stones, tough and low, shaped by wind and drought. Their branches were tangled, gray-brown, armed with small points. Such bushes belonged to the wilderness as much as the rocks did. They clung to dry ground with stubborn life. A shepherd would pass 100 of them without turning his head. Nothing about them promised glory, and that was part of the mystery. The holy was not about to descend upon a cedar of Lebanon, tall and fragrant, nor upon a carved altar in a city, nor within the halls of Pharaoh where men believed power lived. It would appear in a common bush in a barren place, before a fugitive shepherd whose life seemed to have narrowed into obscurity. The choice itself would speak before any words were heard. Moses did not know this yet. He only felt, perhaps, that the mountain air had changed. Not loudly, not with thunder, but with a subtle difference, as if the wilderness had drawn in its own breath and was waiting. The flock continued to move, but the ordinary sound seemed set against a deeper hush. Hooves clicked against stone. A sheep called to another. The wind passed over the ridge. Then somewhere ahead, where the path bent near the lower shoulder of Horeb, a glow appeared. At first it may have seemed like the last light catching upon stone, or a small flame kindled by some traveler hidden beyond the rise. In the wilderness, fire was not strange. Men made fires to warm themselves, to cook, to hold back the dark. Lightning might ignite dry brush. Heat and chance could leave blackened patches where shrubs had burned quickly and vanished into ash. But this glow did not behave like an ordinary flame. Moses slowed. The flock drifted around him, unaware of the meaning gathering in the place. The light ahead flickered among the branches of a thorn bush, bright enough to draw the eye in the fading evening. Fire moved there, living and clear. It wrapped the bush, touched every twig with flame, shone through the tangled branches as though a hidden lamp had been placed inside the wilderness itself. Moses stood with his staff in his hand. He had seen many things in his life. He had seen the splendor of Egypt and the cruelty beneath it. He had seen desert wells and foreign tents, births and seasons, the stubborn survival of animals on hard land. But this sight held him in a way no common fire could have done. The bush burned, and yet it was not consumed. No branch collapsed into ember. No leaves, if any clung to it, curled into ash. No smoke rose in choking darkness. The flame remained, and the bush remained with it. The evening around Moses seemed to deepen, but the fire did not dim. A question opened before him, quiet and irresistible. What was this? Why did the bush not burn away? What kind of fire gives light without devouring what it touches? And why here on this lonely slope after all these years? The man who had fled from Egypt, the shepherd of Midian, the keeper of another man's flock, turned aside from his path. He said within himself, or perhaps aloud into the listening wilderness, "I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burnt." And with that simple decision, the road of exile began to bend toward calling. Midian had taught Moses the language of small things. In Egypt, greatness had spoken in stone. It had risen in pillars, looked down from carved faces, marched in ordered ranks beneath banners and bronze. There, men measured power by the height of walls, the width of rivers, the number of servants who moved when a hand was lifted. But Midian spoke differently. It spoke through the crackle of dry grass beneath sandals, through the nudge of a lamb against the knee, through the shifting color of hills when morning passed into afternoon. It spoke through distances that no one hurried to cross. Each day, Moses rose into a life that seemed too simple for the weight he carried. Before the sun had climbed high enough to harden the ground with heat, he would move among the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, counting by habit, watching for weakness, noticing the ewe that limped, the young ram that wandered too far, the lamb that pressed close to its mother. His hands, once familiar with the manners of courts and the polished smoothness of Egyptian halls, now knew coarse wool, cracked leather, dry wood, and the rough edge of stone. There was a tenderness in the work, though it was not the tenderness of ease. A shepherd could not command the flock as Pharaoh commanded men. Sheep did not answer to pride. They had to be guided around thorn and led toward shade. They had to be watched in places where the ground gave way suddenly, where a ravine could hide danger until a careless hoof slipped into it. The shepherd's strength was patience. His authority was attention. His success was often invisible, marked not by applause but by the fact that evening came and the flock was whole. Moses had learned this slowly. He had learned where the wind changed direction near the rocky folds of the wilderness. He had learned which low shrubs might offer a little grazing when the land seemed bare. He had learned to listen for the difference between ordinary bleating and the sharp cry of distress. He knew the smell of sheep warmed by the sun, the mineral scent of dust rising under many feet, the bitter fragrance of desert plants crushed along the path. He knew the way silence gathered in the ravines, not empty but deep, as if the stones were keeping memory. And beneath that quiet life, Egypt remained. It did not return to him all at once. It came in pieces. A glint of sunlight on a pool of water would become, for a breath, the shine of the Nile. The call of a distant bird might turn his thoughts toward the cries of laborers along the riverbanks. The sight of a young man straining under a load could stir the old wound before Moses even knew he had remembered. Sometimes, while leading the flock through narrow places, he would hear again the harsh rhythm of taskmasters, the sound of blows, the groan of Hebrews bent under burdens too heavy for their bodies and too cruel for their souls. He had once thought he might answer that suffering with his own hand. He had once stepped between violence and the oppressed, but his anger had moved faster than wisdom. One Egyptian lay dead in the sand, one secret had become known, and the life Moses thought he understood had broken open. He had fled with the desert before him and fear behind him, crossing from the world of palaces into a world where no one bowed and no one asked him to speak. Midian had received him not as a prince, not as a deliverer, but as a stranger by a well. Years had passed, enough years for the sharp edge of flight to wear down, enough years for children to know him as father, for Zipporah to know the patterns of his moods, for Jethro to trust him with the flock. Enough years for people to look at him and see a shepherd. But there are memories that do not disappear simply because a man changes his clothes. Moses wore the garments of Midian now, sun-faded and practical, rough against the skin, wrapped for walking and weather. His beard had grown with the years. Lines had gathered around his eyes, not only from age but from distance, from looking across long places where nothing seemed to move, and yet everything was being shaped by time. When he spoke, he did not speak quickly. The desert had drawn haste out of him. It had taught him that some things cannot be forced open. That day, he led the flock beyond the nearer pastures. The common paths were familiar, but familiar ground could become thin after many days of grazing. So Moses moved carefully toward the far side of the wilderness, toward the region of Horeb, the mountain of God. The name may have rested on the land long before Moses understood what it would mean. To the eye, it was rugged country, rising in hard ridges and shadowed clefts, with slopes that caught the light unevenly. The earth was burnt gold where the sun touched it, blue-gray where the rocks withdrew into shade. Sparse bushes clung to the ground as if holding themselves against the wind. The flock moved in a loose line, not as an army, but as a living cloud of wool and dust. Hooves clicked against stone. A bell, perhaps tied to one animal, sounded now and then in a dull, irregular note. Moses kept to the edge, staff in hand, his gaze moving over the animals, then ahead, then to the sides. A shepherd's eyes were never idle. A patch of green could be provision. A sudden shadow could be threat. A circling bird could mean death somewhere beyond the ridge. The afternoon lengthened. Heat rose from the ground in wavering veils. The air held that dry taste known to all who dwell in wilderness places, as if each breath carried a little of the ancient stone into the mouth. Moses guided the flock toward a quieter stretch near the mountain, where the land folded inward. Here the sound of the animals softened, caught by rock and distance. The world seemed to narrow to dust, wool, stone, and sky, and then something appeared beyond the ordinary paths. At first, it may have been no more than a brightness where brightness did not belong. Moses had seen desert light deceive the eye. He had watched heat shimmer until the ground seemed to ripple like water. He had seen the last sun flash against stone so fiercely that a man might mistake rock for flame. But this was not like that. This light gathered around a bush. It was a small thing, low to the ground, one of the thorny growths that survived where larger trees could not. Such bushes were common in that country, dry-limbed, stubborn, rooted in poor soil. They could catch fire easily enough if lightning struck, or if heat and accident met in the right way. A burning bush in itself might not have been strange for long, but this fire remained. Moses stopped. The flock continued a few steps before the change in his movement drew them into a scattered pause. Some lowered their heads, searching the ground. One lamb bleated softly. Dust drifted and settled around their legs. Moses did not call out. He watched. The flame moved upon the bush, alive with color, yet the branches did not blacken into ruin. Fire curled around twig and thorn, but no ash fell. No smoke thickened the air in the ordinary way. The bush was held inside brightness, and still it remained itself. The longer he looked, the less he understood. A man who had survived by caution does not quickly approach the unknown. Moses had learned not to trust every appearance. He had learned in Egypt that power could be dangerous. He had learned in the wilderness that beauty could hide peril. Yet wonder drew him before fear could close the door. There was no roar, no storm, no command at first, only the sight of fire that did not consume. The wilderness around him seemed to grow attentive. Even the small sounds stood apart from one another. The faint scrape of a hoof, the stirring of wool, the whisper of wind moving over stone. Somewhere higher on the slope, a loosened pebble shifted and clicked down into a hollow place. Moses heard these things because he had become a man who heard small things. But in the center of it all, the burning bush held his gaze. What kind of flame gives light without destroying? The question did not come to him as doctrine. It came as a shepherd's question, a man's question, simple and direct. He knew dry branches. He knew how quickly they vanished in fire. He knew the smell that should have risen, the collapse that should have followed. But before him was a fire that acted like fire and yet refused to do what fire always did. Perhaps he looked back at the flock, measuring the distance. A shepherd did not abandon what was entrusted to him. Perhaps he searched the surrounding slopes for another person, someone who might have kindled the flame, someone hidden among the rocks. But the wilderness offered no explanation. There were no footprints calling out their meaning, no human voice, no sign of a camp nearby. Only the bush, burning and unconsumed. The memory of Egypt stirred again, but differently now. He had seen a people afflicted and not destroyed. He had seen his own kin pressed under labor, their bodies bent but their identity not erased. He had seen cruelty blaze against them, and yet they remained. He himself had passed through danger that should have swallowed him. As an infant, he had been placed upon the river, where death had been commanded over Hebrew sons, and yet he had lived. In Pharaoh's house, in the desert, at the well in Midian, his life had been spared more than once. He may not have woven these things together in that moment, but the threads were there, waiting near the edge of understanding. Before the night was over, the flame would mean more than wonder. But not yet. For now, Moses stood between the life he had known and the voice he had not expected to hear. One path led back to the flock, to the measured duties of a shepherd, to the shelter of ordinary things. The other led toward a sight that had no ordinary explanation. No crowd watched him. No king pressed him. No slave cried out in front of him. No family member urged him forward. This turning would be small enough to miss if heaven had not marked it. He said, "I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burnt." It was not a speech of confidence. It was not the declaration of a hero. It was the honest sentence of a man who had noticed something wholly beginning at the edge of his workday. He did not yet know that this single step away from the common path would open the hidden wound of Egypt, the name of God, the burden of deliverance, and the long road back to the place he had fled. He only knew that the bush was burning. He only knew that it was not consumed. And so Moses turned aside. When Moses turned aside, the wilderness seemed to lean inward with him. The flock had gone on shifting and grazing behind him, but their sounds grew strangely distant, as though the valley itself had drawn a veil between the ordinary and the holy. The dry brush crackled beneath his feet. A faint wind moved over the stones. The fire in the thorn bush lifted and folded within itself, bright as living gold, yet no branch blackened. No leaf curled into ash, no smoke rose heavy into the air. It was flame without hunger. It was light without ruin. Moses came nearer, and then from the midst of the bush a voice called his name. Moses, Moses. Not once as a stranger might call from across a slope. Twice with the fullness of recognition. Twice with the weight of one who had known him before he knew himself. The sound was not like any voice Moses had heard in Egypt, nor like the speech of Midianite shepherds by their fires, nor like the cry of a wanderer lost among the hills. It came from the flame, yet it did not scorch the air. It seemed to rise from the earth beneath him and descend from the height above him. It entered the silence as command and mercy together. Moses stopped. For a man who had spent many years unanswered by his own past, to hear his name spoken so clearly was itself a trembling thing. He had once been named in a royal house. He had once been known among Hebrew slaves. He had become known in Midian as a husband, a father, a keeper of sheep. But none of those names had reached so deeply as this calling from the fire. The voice did not summon an idea of him or the memory of what he had been. It called the hidden man himself, and Moses answered, "Here am I." The words were simple, but they stood between two lives. Behind him lay the road of exile, years of dust, years of learning to walk slowly after a flock, years in which Egypt may have seemed like a closed door at the far edge of memory. Before him burned a mystery that had already broken the pattern of his days. He did not yet know how much would be asked of him. He only knew that the one who spoke had not mistaken him for another. Then the voice said, "Draw not nigh hither, put off thy shoes from off thy feet, for the place whereon thou standest is holy ground." Moses looked down. His sandals were made for stone and thorn, for the sharp little cuts of the desert path, for the long slopes where loose gravel slid beneath the heel. They carried the dust of the mountain, the smell of animals, the marks of distance. They were the covering of a working man, useful and worn, fitted to the life he now understood. But at the word of God, even the most ordinary covering became too much to bring forward unchanged. He bent slowly and loosened them. The leather straps gave beneath his fingers. One foot, then the other, touched the ground bare. The earth was not soft. It was rough, cool where the shadow lay, warm where the day's heat had settled into the stone. Tiny grains pressed into his skin. The wilderness did not change its shape. The mountain did not become a temple built with hands. There were no carved pillars, no curtain, no lampstand, no altar of gold. Yet the ground beneath him had become holy because God had chosen to reveal himself there. And before the night was over, Moses would begin to understand that holiness is not created by human splendor. It is born from the nearness of the Lord. He stood barefoot before the burning bush, and the flame continued to live upon the branches without consuming them. Then the voice spoke again. I am the God of thy father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At those words, Moses hid his face. He was afraid to look upon God. The names reached backward through generations like a deep river beneath the surface of time. Abraham, who left his country at the word of the Lord and walked toward a promise he did not yet possess. Isaac, the child of laughter, the son laid upon the wood and given back by mercy. Jacob, the wanderer, the wrestler, the father of the tribes who had gone down into Egypt when famine covered the land. These were not distant stories only. They were the roots of Moses' own people. They were the covenant memory of Israel, carried through years of bondage, whispered in houses where brick dust clung to skin, remembered by elders whose backs bent beneath burdens. The God speaking from the bush was not a new God of the mountain. He was not a spirit of flame passing through the wilderness for a moment. He was the Lord of the fathers, the God who had bound himself by promise, the one who remembered when men forgot, the one whose faithfulness had not grown weak in the long silence of slavery. Moses hid his face because the past was no longer only past. It stood before him in flame. The stories he had heard, perhaps from his mother in the secret tenderness of early childhood, perhaps from the lips of his people as he grew old enough to know he belonged to them, now gathered into one living declaration. The God of Abraham had called him by name. The God of Isaac had made the stones holy beneath his feet. The God of Jacob had drawn near in fire that did not destroy. Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people which are in Egypt. There was no rush in the words, no strain, no uncertainty. I have surely seen. The misery of Israel had not been hidden. Every forced labor under the Egyptian sun, every cry from the brickfields, every command barked by taskmasters, every mother's fear, every old man's groan, every child born under the shadow of bondage had been seen. The years had been long, but they had not been unseen years. The burden had been bitter, but it had not been carried outside the knowledge of God. And have heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters. The voice continued, for I know their sorrows. Moses remained covered before the flame. There are words that do not merely inform the mind, they uncover what has been buried. I know their sorrows. It was not said from a distance. It was not the cold notice of a ruler counting the griefs of a people. It was knowledge with compassion in it, knowledge that had descended into the ache itself. Israel's cry had reached heaven, though heaven had seemed far above the mud pits. Their suffering had entered the heart of the God of their fathers, and slowly the meaning of the bush began to deepen. The fire that burned without consuming was not only a wonder to hold the eyes, it was a sign placed in the wilderness before the man God had called. Israel was afflicted, yet not destroyed. The people were pressed under Pharaoh's hand, yet not consumed. The promise burned among them in hidden form, alive though surrounded by thorns, bright though men could not explain how it continued. Egypt had tried to devour them with labor and fear, yet the covenant life of God remained. Moses had come to see why the bush was not burnt. Now he was hearing why Israel had not vanished. The Lord said, "And I am come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians." Those words must have moved through Moses like wind through a closed house. Deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, not comfort them only, not observe them from afar, not leave their cries suspended in the air between earth and heaven. The God who had seen had come down. The God who had heard was preparing to act, and to bring them up out of that land unto a good land and a large. The voice said, "Unto a land flowing with milk and honey." The wilderness around Moses was bare and stony, but the promise opened beyond it like a valley after rain. A good land, a broad land, a land not ruled by whips and quotas, not measured by bricks without straw, not filled with the cries of men bent under another king's command. A land of pasture, vineyards, trees, wells, and fields where families might lift their heads beneath the blessing of God. The promise given to Abraham had not died in Egypt. It had waited, and now it was beginning to move. But the mystery had not reached its deepest point yet. Moses may have thought, for one brief and trembling moment, that he had been called simply to hear the announcement of deliverance. Perhaps the Lord had drawn him to the mountain to reveal that the time had come. Perhaps he would be allowed to carry the news quietly to Jethro's tents, to tell Zipporah, to remember from afar that his people would be freed by the mighty hand of God. Perhaps he could remain the witness, the shepherd who had once seen fire in a bush and heard the mercy of the Lord declared over Israel. But what he did not yet understand was waiting just beyond the next words. The voice said, "Come now therefore, and I will send thee unto Pharaoh, that thou mayest bring forth my people the children of Israel out of Egypt." The flame did not change, yet everything around Moses seemed to narrow. "I will send thee unto Pharaoh." The name of Pharaoh was more than the name of a man. It was a palace. It was judgment. It was power seated on a throne above the labor of the Hebrews. It was the memory of the court from which Moses had fled. It was the shadow of the deed that had driven him into exile. It was the river, the city, the taskmasters, the hidden blood in the sand, the fear that had once sent him running toward a life where no Egyptian prince would seek him. Now the God of his fathers was calling him back, not back as a fugitive slipping through old streets, not back as a son of Pharaoh's daughter seeking favor, not back as a restless Hebrew trying in his own strength to defend his brothers. He was to return as one sent by God. He was to stand before Pharaoh and speak words that did not originate in his own heart. He was to face the place of his fear with the burden of deliverance laid upon him. The shepherd's staff in his hand must have felt very small. He had no army gathered on the slope. No chariot waited behind him. No visible sign of authority surrounded him except the fire that would not burn away. His clothes were the garments of a desert shepherd. His feet were bare upon holy ground. His life in Midian had been quiet compared with the roar of Egypt. The years had taught him patience, but they had not made him eager to stand before kings. And yet the command came with unmistakable clarity. "I will send thee." There, in the darkening wilderness, the central wound of Moses' life was touched by the call of God. The past he had left behind was not merely remembered. It was being reopened for the sake of redemption. The fear he had outlived was not being ignored. It was being drawn into obedience. The people he had once tried to help in his own confused strength were now to be delivered by the Lord's power, and Moses was to become the trembling instrument of that deliverance. He had turned aside to look at a bush. He was being sent to confront an empire. For a long moment, the mountain held its breath. The flame moved softly among the branches. Far behind him, an animal shifted in the fading light. The stones beneath his bare feet reminded him that he stood where God had told him to stand, not where he had chosen to go. And the voice that called him had spoken not only of Israel's sorrow, but of Israel's future. Still, Moses knew himself. He knew the hesitation that rose inside him. He knew the years that had passed. He knew the distance between a lonely shepherd and the throne of Egypt. He knew the weight of returning to a land where his name carried memory and danger. The command had been given, but the man receiving it felt the tremor of all that it meant. And so the question began to form within him, humble and troubled, not yet rebellion, not yet refusal, but the first honest answer of a soul startled by the size of God's calling. Who am I that I should go unto Pharaoh? The words hovered at the edge of speech while the bush burned on, bright and unconsumed, and Moses stood barefoot before the God who had seen, heard, known, and come down. The question came from the deepest place in Moses, from the years that had taught him to walk carefully, to speak less, to keep his name small beneath the wide sky of Midian. Who am I, that I should go unto Pharaoh, and that I should bring forth the children of Israel out of Egypt? The fire did not lean away from him. The bush did not collapse into ash. The slope of Horeb remained as it had been, stone and thorn and wind, but the air around Moses seemed to hold the question without scolding it. He had not asked for greatness. He had not offered himself as deliverer. He had not come searching for a throne or a staff of command or a people to follow him through the wilderness. He had come with sheep. He had come with the dust of an ordinary day on his feet. And the answer of God did not begin by telling Moses who Moses was. It began with who would be with him. Certainly I will be with thee. The words settled over the mountain with a weight more solid than the stones. Not, certainly you are strong. Not, certainly you are prepared. Not, certainly Egypt has forgotten. Not, certainly Pharaoh will listen. The Lord placed the whole calling upon the promise of his presence. Moses' weakness was not denied, but it was no longer the center of the matter. His fear had spoken of the size of the task. God answered with the nearness of himself. And there, before the thorn bush that burned without being consumed, Moses began to learn the first truth of his calling. The one who is sent does not carry the burden alone. The Lord gave him a sign, but it was a sign that belonged to the future. When thou hast brought forth the people out of Egypt, ye shall serve God upon this mountain. Moses stood on Horeb as one man, with one flock behind him and no visible path before him. Yet God spoke of a day when many feet would stand where his feet now stood bare upon holy ground. The mountain that held him in fear would one day receive a rescued nation. The lonely slope would become a place of worship. The place of calling would become the place of covenant. But that day had not yet come. Between this fire and that worship lay Pharaoh, bondage, signs, judgment, sea, wilderness, and the long patience of God. Moses could not see those things in order. He could only hear that the promise had already passed beyond his fear and was waiting for him on the other side. Still, another question rose in him. It did not rise from defiance, but from the weight of returning to a people who might not recognize him. He had been born among them, hidden among them, wept over among them, but raised in Pharaoh's house. Then he had fled. Years had gone by. The slaves of Egypt had known taskmasters, mud pits, lash marks, and buried hopes. If Moses returned saying that the God of their fathers had sent him, would they lift their heads? Would they remember the promises given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Would they believe that the silence had broken? Moses said unto God, Behold, when I come unto the children of Israel, and shall say unto them, The God of your fathers hath sent me unto you, and they shall say to me, What is his name? What shall I say unto them? For a moment everything seemed to draw inward. The desert air, the stones, the flame within the branches. Moses had asked for the name, not merely a title, not merely a memory attached to old stories. He asked what he should carry into the darkness of Egypt when men and women, bent by labor, asked whether the God of their fathers had truly come near. And God said unto Moses, I am that I am. The words were unlike the names of Egypt. They were not carved out of sun or river or beast or sky. They did not depend upon temples built by human hands. They did not rise and fall with dynasties. I am that I am, the one who is, the one who will be what he will be, the living God whose being rests in no other, whose promise is not weakened by time, whose compassion does not need permission from Pharaoh. And he said, Thus shalt thou say unto the children of Israel, I am hath sent me unto you. Moses stood beneath that name, and the name was larger than the wilderness, larger than Egypt, larger than his own shame. The God who spoke from the bush was the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. This was his name forever, and his memorial unto all generations. The calling was not a new thought in the mind of God. It was the unfolding of a promise older than Moses' fear. Before Moses had been drawn from the river, before he had struck the Egyptian, before he had crossed the desert as a fugitive, the Lord had remembered his covenant. And now, the forgotten groans of the slaves were being gathered into that remembrance. The Lord told Moses to go, to gather the elders of Israel, and to speak the words given to him. He was to say that the Lord God of their fathers had appeared unto him. He was to tell them that God had surely visited them and seen what was done to them in Egypt. He was to speak of bringing them up out of affliction into a land flowing with milk and honey. The words were rich with promise, but they would have to pass first through narrow rooms, tired faces, and hearts made cautious by long disappointment. The Lord said they would hearken to his voice. Moses was to go with the elders unto the king of Egypt and say that the Lord God of the Hebrews had met with them. They were to ask leave to go 3 days' journey into the wilderness to sacrifice unto the Lord their God. But God also told Moses what waited inside Pharaoh's palace. I am sure that the king of Egypt will not let you go, no, not by a mighty hand. The promise did not hide the resistance. God did not paint the road as easy to calm the servant he was sending. Pharaoh's refusal was already known. The hardening, the pride, the contest between human power and divine command, none of it surprised the Lord. Moses was not being sent because Pharaoh was reasonable. He was being sent because God had come down. And before the night of Egypt would finally open, the Lord would stretch out his hand and smite Egypt with all his wonders. After that, Pharaoh would let them go. The same hand that called from fire would move through the land of bondage. The same voice that spoke from the thorn bush would be heard in courts and houses and fields and riverbanks. Egypt would learn that the Hebrews were not abandoned, and Israel would learn that the God of their fathers was not distant. The fire continued, bright within the branches, neither spreading nor fading. Yet Moses still felt the trembling of the task. The words had been given, the name had been revealed, the outcome had been declared, but in his mind he could see faces turning away. He could imagine the elders staring at him with suspicion, their eyes narrowed by years of false hopes. What if the people said the Lord had not appeared to him? What if his return reopened old wounds? What if the first door closed before he even reached Pharaoh? And Moses answered and said, But behold, they will not believe me, nor hearken unto my voice. For they will say, The Lord hath not appeared unto thee. The Lord did not answer by argument alone. He drew Moses' attention to what was already in his hand. What is that in thine hand? A rod. It was the plain staff of a shepherd, worn by use, touched by dust, familiar to Moses' palm. With it he guided sheep over uneven ground. With it he leaned when the day was long. With it he measured the small responsibilities of a hidden life. It was not a sword. It was not a scepter from Egypt. It was not a symbol anyone in Pharaoh's court would have feared. And God said, "Cast it on the ground." Moses cast it upon the ground, and it became a serpent. The change was sudden and living. The ordinary thing slipped out of the shape he knew and moved with a danger that made his body answer before his thoughts could arrange themselves. Moses fled from before it. The man who had stood before unconsuming fire stepped back from the serpent on the ground, and the movement revealed how near fear still was. But the Lord said unto Moses, "Put forth thine hand and take it by the tail." The command required trust in the very place where instinct warned him away. To seize a serpent by the tail was not the way of caution. Yet Moses reached out. His fingers closed around the living sign, and as he took it, it became a rod in his hand. The staff returned, but it was no longer merely the tool of a shepherd in Moses' understanding. It had become a witness. The Lord could take what was ordinary and make it speak. He could turn the familiar into a sign. He could place authority into the hand that felt empty, and the people would see and believe that the Lord God of their fathers had appeared unto him. Then the Lord gave another sign. "Put now thine hand into thy bosom." Moses obeyed, placing his hand against his chest beneath the fold of his garment. When he drew it out, his hand was leprous as snow. The sight must have struck him with a coldness sharper than the mountain wind. The skin that had been whole was marked with whiteness, a visible uncleanness, a sign of separation and decay. For one breath he held before his own eyes the image of what no man wished to carry. Then the Lord said, "Put thine hand into thy bosom again." Moses placed it back. When he plucked it out again, behold, it was turned again as his other flesh. The sign was not only power, it was restoration. The God who could expose affliction could also heal. The God who saw the brokenness of Israel was not helpless before it. What appeared ruined in one moment could be made whole by his command. If they would not believe the first sign, they might believe the voice of the latter sign. And if they would not believe those two signs, Moses was to take water of the river and pour it upon dry land, and the water would become blood upon the ground. The river of Egypt, worshipped and depended upon, would not stand beyond God's reach. The life of the land could become a testimony in the dust. Still, Moses had one more resistance, and this one belonged not to the people, not to Pharaoh, not to the signs, but to his own mouth. "O my Lord, I am not eloquent, neither heretofore, nor since thou hast spoken unto thy servant, but I am slow of speech and of a slow tongue." The confession lay bare before the flame. Moses did not see himself as a speaker. Whatever the years in Egypt had taught him, whatever wisdom he had once received, whatever memory lived within him, he felt the weakness of words. Perhaps they came slowly. Perhaps they failed him under pressure. Perhaps the thought of standing before Pharaoh and elders and slaves tightened his tongue before he even began. The Lord answered with a question that reached beneath speech itself. "Who hath made man's mouth? Or who maketh the dumb, or deaf, or the seeing, or the blind? Have not I the Lord?" The one who sent Moses was not unaware of the mouth he had made. His calling had not overlooked the servant's limitation. God had not mistaken him for another man. The weakness Moses named was already known to the Lord who formed him. And if the maker of the mouth commanded him to speak, then the success of the word did not depend upon eloquence alone. "Now therefore go, and I will be with thy mouth, and teach thee what thou shalt say." Again the promise returned to presence. "I will be with thee. I will be with thy mouth." The Lord's answer kept gathering Moses away from himself and toward God. The fire, the name, the signs, the future worship on the mountain, the promise to teach him speech, all of it pointed in one direction. The deliverance would belong to God, yet the fear in Moses had deep roots. Even after the signs, even after the name, even after the promise, he said, "O my Lord, send, I pray thee, by the hand of him whom thou wilt send." It was the nearest he came to asking that another be chosen. The moment carried a sorrowful honesty. Moses had run from Egypt, lived in obscurity, learned the speech of sheep and wilderness. Now the Lord was pressing him back toward the wound. The calling did not flatter him, it summoned him. And the servant, overwhelmed by mercy and command together, hesitated at the edge. The anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses. Not a wild anger, not an uncontrolled flame, but the holy displeasure of the God who had answered every fear and was now meeting refusal. Yet even there, mercy came with provision. Is not Aaron the Levite thy brother? I know that he can speak well. And also, behold, he cometh forth to meet thee. And when he seeth thee, he will be glad in his heart. Aaron was already on the way. Before Moses had returned to camp, before he had packed for Egypt, before he had spoken to Jethro, God had set another set of footsteps in motion. The brother from the house of bondage was coming toward the brother from the wilderness. One had remained among the people. One had lived far from them. Soon they would meet, and gladness would rise between them like water in a dry place. The Lord told Moses that he would speak unto Aaron and put words in his mouth. God would be with Moses' mouth and with Aaron's mouth, and would teach them what to do. Aaron would speak unto the people, and Moses would be to him instead of God, carrying the divine message given at the bush. And the rod, the simple shepherd's staff, Moses was to take in his hand, wherewith he would do signs. At last the questions had been answered, one by one. Who am I? I will be with thee. What is your name? I am hath sent me. What if they do not believe? Take the rod, the sign in the hand, the healed flesh, the river turned to blood. What if I cannot speak? I made the mouth, and I will teach thee. Aaron thy brother shall help thee. The fire still burned, but its mystery had widened. It was not only a marvel in the desert. It was a picture of Israel's affliction and God's faithfulness. A bush burning, yet not consumed. A people oppressed, yet not destroyed. A servant afraid, yet not abandoned. A promise delayed, yet not forgotten. Moses stood barefoot before the Lord with the rod in his hand and the name of God laid upon his future. The wilderness around him had not changed, but everything ahead of him had. The flock would have to be returned. Jethro would have to be told. The road to Egypt would have to be faced step by step. And somewhere beyond the ridges, Aaron was already walking to meet him. The flame did not hurry him. It remained where it had been, gathered in the thorn bush, as though the small branches had become a lamp placed by the hand of God. Around it, the wilderness had deepened. The last red of evening had withdrawn behind the ridges, and the slopes of Horeb lay under a wide blue darkness. Stones that had been sharp with sun were now only shapes. The far folds of the mountain seemed to lean closer, not threatening but listening. Moses stood barefoot on the holy ground, with the dust cool beneath his feet and the rod in his hand. For a while, he did not move. The words of the Lord had entered him more deeply than the desert wind ever could. They had not been many compared with the long years of his life, yet they had carried the weight of generations. I have surely seen, I have heard, I know, I am come down. Come now therefore, and I will send thee. The wilderness held those words. They did not fade when the voice became silent. They remained as real as the staff beneath his fingers, as near as the ground beneath his soles. Moses had lived many years with what he had seen. He had seen the Egyptian striking the Hebrew. He had seen fear in his own heart. He had seen the backside of the desert, the slow movement of sheep, the empty distances where no one asked him to be more than a shepherd. But now he had learned that he had not been the only one seeing. God had seen. That was the beginning of the answer, not Moses' courage, not Moses' eloquence, not Moses' certainty. The story did not begin again because a forgotten man suddenly became strong. It began because the Lord had looked upon the affliction of his people and had remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And before Moses took even one step away from that place, this truth settled over him like the night itself. The cries in Egypt had never risen into emptiness. He bent slowly and reached for his sandals. The leather was rough in his hands, familiar from long roads and daily labor. A little dust clung to the straps. He looked at them as a man might look at an ordinary thing after heaven has touched the earth. And for a moment he understood that nothing common was truly common when God chose to meet a man there. The bush had been a bush. The staff had been a staff. The mountain had been a mountain. His hands had been the hands of a keeper of sheep. Yet the Lord had taken each of these and filled them with meaning. He placed the sandals upon his feet again, not because the ground had become less holy, but because the command would require walking. There was still a path down from the mountain. There would be the flock to gather and lead back through the darkened folds of land. There would be the quiet enclosure near Jethro's tents, the low breathing of animals, the dim glow of household fire, the face of Zipporah, the small movements of his sons, the practical questions that always wait for a man after a revelation. Where have you been? Why are you late? What happened on the mountain? And after that, there would be words harder to speak. I must return to Egypt. The name of that land moved through him like a closed door beginning to open. Egypt was not only a place on a map. It was memory, power, palace stone, river mist, the cry of laborers, the weight of a deed he had tried to leave behind. It was the land where he had once been both near royalty and near ruin. It was the place from which he had run with no promise that he would ever be called back. But now the road to Egypt was no longer the road of a fugitive. It was the road of a servant sent by God. Moses lifted his eyes toward the burning bush once more. In the deeper dark, its fire appeared even clearer. It did not throw wild light. It did not spread across the ground. It remained contained, steady, alive. No ash fell. No branch collapsed into blackness. The thorn bush, frail and ordinary, was held within flame and yet preserved. And slowly, the sign opened more fully within him. Israel was like that bush, surrounded by affliction, pressed under command, heated by suffering, yet not consumed. Pharaoh could burden, taskmasters could strike, years could pass, infants could be threatened, mothers could weep, men could bend under brick and straw. But the people of the covenant had not vanished. Their life remained because God had not removed his eye from them. And Moses, too, was like that bush. He had carried fire in the soul, the fire of anger, the fire of guilt, the fire of memory, the fire of fear. He had expected such things to consume him slowly until he became only an old shepherd with an unnamed sorrow. Yet here he stood, not destroyed, not discarded, not beyond calling. The Lord had found him where no palace voice could reach him. The Lord had spoken his name in the wilderness. Moses, Moses. The sound of it still seemed to rest in the air. He had answered, "Here am I," before he knew what that answer would cost. Now he knew more, not all, but enough. The path ahead would not be simple. The elders of Israel would have to hear him. Pharaoh would not easily open his hand. Wonders would come and judgments, and nights when the difference between faith and fear would feel very thin. Moses did not yet see the sea divided, or the manna upon the ground, or the mountain clothed later in cloud and thunder. He did not see the long future in full. God had not given him the whole road spread out like a scroll. He had given him his name. I am that I am. That was enough for the first step. The wilderness wind moved lightly across the slope. It passed over the stones, through the dry brush around the place where Moses stood. The flame leaned with it, yet did not break. Somewhere far below, a sheep gave a faint call, and another answered. Life continued at the edge of mystery. The world had not stopped turning because a man had heard God. But for Moses, every ordinary sound now belonged to a changed world. He took the staff more firmly. A shepherd's rod was a simple thing, worn by use, polished where the palm had held it for years. It had guided animals away from danger. It had steadied a man over rough ground. It had marked his life in Midian. But the Lord had said it would become a sign. Moses had seen it fall and become a serpent. He had drawn back from it, then taken it again by the tail at God's command. He had watched the impossible return to his hand. Now in the darkness, the staff was only wood again. Yet he would never hold it the same way. It was not power in itself. It was not a charm. It was not the greatness of Moses. It was a witness that God can take what is already in a man's hand and make it speak beyond him. Moses would carry no army down from Horeb. He would carry a rod, a message, and the presence of the Lord who had promised, "Certainly I will be with thee." Those words steadied him, not because they explained everything, but because they changed the weight of everything. He turned slightly, looking down the slope where the path would begin. The darkness below was thick between the rocks, but not empty. His own steps would find the way. He had crossed this ground many times before in the service of another man's flock. He knew where loose stones waited, where the path narrowed, where the thorn branches caught at garments, where the valley opened into safer walking. The Lord had met him in a place he already knew, and yet made it altogether new. That too was a mercy. Sometimes the holy does not arrive by carrying a man to a distant country. Sometimes it burns at the edge of the path he has walked for 40 years, until the familiar place becomes the threshold of obedience. Moses began to descend. His first steps were careful. The sandals found the dust. The staff touched stone, then lifted, then touched again. Behind him, the bush continued to burn, and the warm light followed him for a little while, laying a faint bronze edge upon the folds of his robe. The rough wool moved against his legs. His shadow stretched long and bent across the uneven ground, then softened as he moved farther from the fire. He did not look like a prince. He did not look like the deliverer of a nation. He looked like an old shepherd coming down a mountain after dark. But heaven had placed a command within him, and that command would outlast every appearance. As he walked, the silence became different from the silence before. Earlier, it had been the silence of distance, the silence of years, the silence of questions unanswered. Now it was the silence after a word has been given, when the soul must carry it carefully. Moses did not need to fill it. The night did not ask him to speak. Even his fear had changed its shape. It was still there, but it no longer sat upon the throne. Beneath it was the promise. Beside it was the name. Ahead of it was the road. And somewhere beyond the wilderness, another man was already being moved by God. Aaron. Moses did not yet hear his brother's footsteps. He did not yet see his face in the half-light or feel the old recognition rise between them after years apart. But the Lord had spoken of him, and that was enough to place companionship within the future. The calling that had seemed too heavy for one man would not be carried in isolation. God had already prepared help before Moses had finished objecting. This is how deliverance began, not with trumpets in Egypt, not with Pharaoh trembling on his throne, not with the people already free. It began with a shepherd under a dark sky, walking down from holy ground, holding a staff and a secret fire in his heart. It began with a God who saw suffering before the sufferer saw rescue. It began with a name too deep to be exhausted by fear. It began in a wilderness where no crowd gathered, where no record was carved into palace walls, where the only witnesses were stones, wind, sheep, flame, and the man who had turned aside. The mountain grew darker behind him. The flame became smaller as distance gathered around it, until it looked less like a blaze and more like a single ember held in the hand of night. But even when Moses could no longer see it clearly, he knew it had burned. He knew what had been said. The memory of that fire would go with him into tents, onto roads, before elders, before Pharaoh, through signs and refusals and long obedience. There would be moments when he would need to remember that nothing in the bush had been consumed. There would be moments when Israel would need to remember it too. For the God who calls from fire is not careless with what he holds. He can draw near without destroying. He can reveal holiness without crushing the one who bows before it. He can send a trembling servant and remain the true strength behind him. He can allow the wilderness to grow dark and still leave enough light for the next step. Moses reached the lower path. The flock was there, scattered in the dimness, their pale backs barely visible against the earth. They shifted as he came near, recognizing the sound of him. The staff moved lightly, and the animals began to gather. There was no haste now, only movement. One by one they turned toward the way home. Above them, Horeb stood in shadow. Behind them, the unseen flame kept its witness. Ahead of them, the tents of Midian waited, and beyond those tents, though far off and wrapped in uncertainty, waited Egypt. The same Egypt that had haunted memory would become the place where God's word would confront power. The same past Moses had fled would become the ground of obedience. The same people who groaned under bondage would learn that the Lord had not forgotten their names. The night settled lower. Colors withdrew from the land until only outlines remained. The path, the rocks, the moving flock, the robe of Moses, the staff in his hand, all softened into the dark. Yet the story was not fading. It was becoming hidden, carried inward, like seed beneath soil. What had happened on the mountain would unfold slowly in the days to come, and every step away from the bush was also a step toward the promise. Moses walked with the flock beneath the deep wilderness sky. He was leaving holy ground, but not leaving the presence of God. And this is the calm resolution of the night. The Lord who sees affliction does not merely observe it from afar. He hears. He knows. He comes down. He calls by name. He sends help. He gives his presence for the road that must be walked. A lonely wilderness can become the place where purpose is spoken. An ordinary staff can become a sign. A fearful man can become a servant. A suffering people can become a delivered people. And a small flame burning where no one expected it can reveal that God's promises are not consumed by time. So Moses continued into the darkness, changed but not complete, afraid but not alone, burdened but upheld. The mountain receded. The flock moved softly before him. The staff touched the earth in a steady rhythm. And somewhere within him, deeper than memory, deeper than regret, deeper than the long silence of Midian, the name of the Lord remained. I am. The road ahead would wait until morning. For now, there was only the night, the path, the quiet flock, the cooling dust, and the unseen God who had spoken from the fire and would go with his servant all the way back to Egypt.